over nearly 10 generations and over 1,000 Pokemon. Some weren't just good, they were downright broken. So much so that Pokemon and Game Freak had to step in and intervene. We're gonna break down all of those broken Pokemon over the years and how they got nerfed. What's going on, guys? It's Danner A-Drive, and today we're taking a look at the most ridiculous and overpowered Pokemon in the history of the franchise and the nerfs that brought them back down to earth. If you guys enjoyed this video, like it down below and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss out on our epic Pokemon content. Without further ado, let's kick it off with one of the most infamous Mega Evolutions of all time. The best ability ever printed until it wasn't. Mega Kangaskhan was the first Mega that made competitive players say, okay, this is too much. This Pokemon had an insanely powerful ability in Parental Bond, which made every attack hit twice with the second hit at 50% power. This meant that Power Up Punch was hitting twice, giving +2 attack. It meant that Fake Out hit twice, guaranteeing more chip damage. It broke Focus Sash instantly, and of course it had really well-rounded stats to top it all off. But it didn't just win, Mega Kangaskhan invalidated entire strategies. Headed into Generation 7, they had a significant nerf for this Pokemon, reducing the second hit power down to 25%, meaning that you weren't going to be able to essentially get this crazy, massive 50% second hit off, and then secondary effects were ultimately limited for Mega Kangaskhan, reducing its effectiveness and putting it more in line with the other Mega Evolutions in the game. Up next is one of the most perfect Pokemon designs ever, but maybe it was just a little too perfect. Aegislash might be the smartest designed Pokemon ever, and that was ultimately the problem. This Pokemon was broken with 150 base defense and 150 base special defense, and then when it switched from its shield form to its blade form, it would have 150 attack and special attack. Not to mention its signature attack, King Shield, would drop attack by 2 stages. It had an incredible move pool, and it had the ability to play offensively and defensively with nearly perfect synergy. Over multiple generations, Game Freak was forced to intervene and nerf Aegislash down to a more manageable level. Not only did they change the way King Shield worked ultimately, but they reduced its base stats entirely, making it so Aegislash is not nearly the threat it once was and is a lot more manageable to deal with if you're as opposing Pokemon on another team. Some of my favorite abilities ever were the 8 abilities. Not the number 8, but the 8 like I just had a spinach wrap for lunch. Sylveon, Mega Gardevoir, Mega Salamence, and Mega Glalie all represented a handful of cool abilities. And don't forget Auroras too, with various abilities that turn normal type attacks into fairy, flying, or ice type attacks, and then gave them a 30% boost on top of that. That made it so Sylveon's Hyper Voice was incredibly strong. Mega Gardevoir became an incredibly powerful wall breaker. Mega Salamence was able to fire off Aerial Aid double edges and beyond to be able to break through things. Glalie Explosion was just absolutely nuts, and they had no other choice but to nerf the 8 abilities from 30% buff to 20% buff, and of course they tightened the distribution. It didn't become something that really got widely distributed, these abilities, and it got held within the confines of just a handful of Pokemon. These were some of my favorite abilities. Galvanated, I think, is another one that we might have forgotten, but these are a few of my favorite abilities that all got a nice nerf because they were just too strong. The sword Pokemon that broke the game. That's right, Zacian was one of the most broken Pokemon that has ever been allowed in standard play. It was insane because it had this ability Intrepid Sword, which gave it an attack buff on every entry. Its Steel and Fairy typing is nearly flawless. It has 148 speed, which outpaces almost everything. And then its 170 attack stat was just simply insanity. Its Intrepid Sword ability now only activates once per battle, and they ultimately reduced its attack stat as well because Zacian was just so incredibly strong. There was no other way to deal with it. It makes you wonder, they try to tip the scales by introducing these incredibly powerful Pokemon, but when you have a Pokemon like Zacian that is just simply so strong, what else can you do but just hit it with the big nerf and hope that it's going to be a little bit more bearing for everything else to stand on its own 4 legs. One of my favorite things in old school Pokemon games was the Weather Wars, and even to this day, you can still have some pretty epic Weather Wars, but back in the day, weather was permanent, if you didn't realize, which meant that Politoed's Drizzle and Ninetales Drought, Tyranitar's Sandstream, and Hippowdon's Sandstream created these very incredible Weather Wars, where once you established your Pokemon onto the field with a weather ability, that weather just stayed forever, meaning that if you didn't have a weather Pokemon on your side, it was incredibly powerful. Now, in Generation 6, they obviously changed that. They nerfed weather to last only 5 turns, and they made it so, you can utilize the various rocks, Icy Rock and Damp Rock, to be able to make weather last for 8 turns, which is still very significant. but those Pokemon, Politoed and Tyranitar and all the other weather abusers, never saw nearly as much love once those big nerfs happened. I thought this was a very positive change for the Pokemon game in general because it doesn't warp team building as much. You can kind of stall it out just as you stall out Trick Room in competitive, but this was a crazy thing to look back on, that these weather wars were just dominant across the metagame for a very long time. One of the most unique Pokemon to ever come into existence was none other than Mimikyu. Mimikyu is super awesome because it's got a really unique ability called Disguise, which allows it to always take one hit for free. Now, what players used to do is utilize Mimikyu with Disguise and a Focus Sash, meaning that you were going to be able to take a hit to break your Disguise, and then take another hit to always live on the Focus Sash. Meaning you could Swords Dance twice and Shadow Sneak, or Swords Dance and Play Rough and still live a hit and then Shadow Sneak. There was a lot of things you can do with Mimikyu being able to set up, being such a powerful Pokemon. However, they nerfed it going into the next generation of games, going into 8, by basically saying that when Disguise breaks, you lose 10% of your health. So this was a significant nerf to Mimikyu, who previously was running Focus Sash everywhere, left, right, and center. And now, unfortunately, it got a big nerf through its ability that ultimately changed how Mimikyu was looked at for generations to come. I still remember the X and Y days where you can spam Priority Brave Bird with a Talonflame and just wreck nearly every team, utilizing things like Swords Dance and Roost to have longevity. This thing was crazy, and Priority Brave Bird should not be allowed, which is why they changed Gale Wings, its signature ability, to only work on full HP Pokemon. Previously, you'd be able to use Gale Wings all the time, which meant you had Priority Roost, you had Priority Brave Bird. Everything that Talonflame was trying to do was priority, which was nuts. They made it so you had to have full HP to be able to utilize the effect, basically taking Talonflame from being one of the most dominant threats in the metagame to ultimately being just a little Pidgey that you could find on Route 1 because it is not nearly as oppressive as it once was. Poor little Smeargle becomes the Pokemon hurt most in this next update, but really it impacts Darkrai the most. If you're not familiar, Dark Void, Darkrai's signature attack, used to be able to be the top move pretty much ever in doubles, being able to sleep both opponents at an 80% clip. But that accuracy got nerfed very quickly moving forward there, as players were abusing Smeargle in an opportunity to be able to put everything to sleep and then just set up and gain in tremendous amounts of advantage. Ultimately, the accuracy for Dark Void was dropped down to 50%, and then Smeargle lost access to it entirely. You actually can't even use Dark Void Smeargle anymore, even with the accuracy drop. So it has to use Spore, which has a few more workarounds. You know, Pokemon can use Safety Goggles, or they can ultimately be Grass type and then get around Spore. So some pretty interesting changes there, but Smeargle and Darkrai both getting a massive nerf when Dark Void came into play and got nerfed from its 80% to 50% accuracy. One of the most shocking nerfs of all time happened to a beloved Pokemon that is Gengar. Gengar used to have only one weakness. It had a ground immunity with its Levitate ability and had perfect synergy with its Ghost and Poison coverage, being able to dominate threats with its massive speed stat and incredible special attack stat. However, it lost its Levitate ability, ultimately moving into Generation 7, and it got replaced by Cursed Body, a much lesser ability. This ties in, obviously, with Mega Evolutions and some of the introductions that happened with Gengar, which previously could switch into an Earthquake and then Mega Evolve and trap things. But ultimately, they decided that was simply too much for this Pokemon, gave it a very mediocre ability. Haunter and Ghastly still keeping Levitate, but Gengar losing it. All of a sudden, this Ghost Pokemon is now grounded. A massive nerf for a Pokemon that otherwise was at its peak in Pokemon. A lesser known nerf happened to one of the legendary Pokemon, Thundurus, the Genie Pokemon. This Pokemon had dominated in the competitive scene, especially in VGC, winning multiple titles, and this Thundurus here was so good because it was able to utilize prankster moves like Thunder Wave, Swagger, and Taunt to be able to shut down entire teams and metagames. A few nerfs took place where electric types could no longer be paralyzed, making it so Thunder Wave was no longer a go-to click auto para button, and then they ultimately nerfed Prankster as well, saying that it no longer works against dark type Pokemon. These are just a few of the nerfs that it received. Confusion got changed slightly, and ultimately Thundurus had some massive knocks down on its pegs in terms of how its competitive viability stacked up against the rest of the metagame, no longer being able to shut down entire teams. Some of the strongest effects to ever come to Pokemon were Protein and Libero, Greninja and Cinderace's signature abilities. These used to activate every single time the user attacked, which ultimately gave you Stab, meaning your attacks were hitting harder, It was incredibly unpredictable, especially with both of these Pokemon having very diverse move pools, being able to access things like U-turn, dark moves, water moves, fire moves. I mean, the list goes on and on what these Pokemon could do, and they were impossible to wall because they were so incredibly offensive. Now, these abilities only work once per switch-in, drastically reducing their effectiveness, and ultimately making it so Greninja and Cinderace are not nearly as strong as they once were. I'm a big fan of Latios and Latias, and they have a very signature held item called the Soul Dew. Well, if you didn't know, Soul Dew used to actually give plus 50% special attack and plus 50% special defense buff, but this got nerfed so hard because 50% is just insanity. That is one of the craziest things. Imagine giving yourself like a choice specs without the limitation on what moves you can click. Soul Dew is much nerfed now. I think it's 20% now. Not nearly what it once was. Still a cool item for these two Pokemon, the Latties, but not nearly as strong as it once was. I can't believe they ever put that in the game. That's crazy. Moody is one of the most controversial abilities of all time, being able to randomly generate stat buffs in between turns. And if you didn't know, Moody used to actually also buff random stats like evasion too, which meant things like Smeargle and Glalie and Libero could sit there and utilize their Moody ability to buff their evasion and ultimately be unhittable. Now, Moody no longer buffs evasion, making some of these Pokemon like Smeargle a lot less viable than they once were. I always remember sitting on Showdown against Moody Pokemon and seeing their stat buffs in the corner just like stacked to the max because you just couldn't hit them long enough and they were able to change their abilities, or change their stat buffs every single turn. Some of these nerfs were small, some a little bit bigger, but these nerfs warped entire generations of the Pokemon franchise. Some Pokemon lost their best abilities, some lost their identities, and some, like Mega Kangaskhan and Mega Salamence, well, they took them out of the game entirely until Legends ZA, but then they didn't even bring them back with abilities. If you enjoyed this video, like the video down below and subscribe to the channel if you guys are new, and stay tuned for more Pokemon videos just like this one right here on the channel. What's your favorite nerf in Pokemon history? Let me know in the comments, and I'll see you next time.